Tonight, we are so very lucky to have Robert O'Connor here with us to talk about a story that I had never heard about before. And at first when you look at it, you're like, how can that possibly be? But it is, and it's one of those unknown stories from World War II. We all know about the USO. We all know about the service members that went out there and did their bit. We know about that. But did you realize that our troops moved so fast after D-Day that they couldn't keep up with them? And that they needed to come up and devise a different way. And that American ingenuity did that. And as we learned last week, morale was so important and why they put so much effort into getting the mail. This is a morale builder too. And keeping our troops happy and keeping our troops in the right frame of mind to continue their arduous job is so important. And we are so very lucky to have this wonderful gentleman that has done extensive research to tell you the backstory of an unknown part of history. So without further ado, I will introduce you to tonight's speaker, Robert O'Connor.
Thank you, Peggy. During the hours and days and weeks and years of researching and writing and then rewriting and then rewriting Jeep Show, sometimes it's pretty lonely and you have in mind what you'd like at the end. And one of the things I had in mind was to be in a place like this with people like you and talk about my work. So thank you for coming out. It really means the world to me. I'm sure we have some veterans here. If you don't mind, stand up so we can thank you. I'm proud to be here with you. Thank you also to the distinguished New Hampshire public school teacher, Eric Salmonson. He interviewed me on his podcast and recommended me to Peggy, so I'm very grateful. I'm full of gratitude to the late David and Carol Wright, Semper Fi David, for this incredible facility. I'm joined here by my wife, Dr. Doralina Angelescu, not American by birth, but American by choice. She was very patient with me as I was finishing this book. I only wish that this World War II veteran served overseas at age 19. My dad was here to be part of this. I wish I could show him this review of Jeep Show. The reviewer said, "It seems odd to call a World War II novel delightful, but that's exactly what you get with O'Connor's mix of history and fiction." I wasn't going for delightful, but I'll take it. I'll take it. Now, is it too late to ask you all a question? Actually, that should be the plural of y'all, which is it too late to ask all of y'all a question? Tell me what these 6 men have in common. Mickey Rooney, the #1 Hollywood box office star in 1939. Carl Reiner, pioneering comedian, author, director, and actor, created The Dick Van Dyke Show. Sammy Davis Jr., incredible singer, dancer, actor, and improv. Pete Seeger, American icon, folk music, genius, and activist. Barney Fife. Don Knotts, very talented comedian. And this is Jim Hetzer, a West Virginia-based promoter whose Hetzer theatrical productions toured America for over 40 years. What do they have in common? Can anyone tell me? They all served in World War II, and they were all military occupation specialty 442, entertainment specialists in the Morale Corps. My talk tonight is about the Morale Corps, this forgotten group of soldiers in the World War II Army. I'm also going to talk about combat infantry. about morale and about the importance of being present and accounted for in times of trouble. Entertainment specialists in the Morale Corps had three main jobs. In the rear echelon, they organized what were called soldier shows, which were plays, amateur shows using a cast of soldiers and a crew of soldiers. And basically it was to keep young men with Army pay in their pockets out of troubling activities off base. In the rear echelon, they also, over in the European Theater of Operations, they also made visits to hospitals and visited wounded soldiers and airmen. I'm going to read you from here my version of Mickey Rooney doing this. This takes place at the Gare du Nord train station in Paris. "Here comes the train. There's Mickey," Wes says to Jim. They're standing on the number 2 platform. "That's timing. Christ, there must be 50 cars." A PR officer and a signal corps photographer are with Mickey. "Hey boys," Mickey calls out, "another day in this man's army." Then, "Charge!" as he jumps up on the train as it hisses to a stop. Jim and Wes follow. There are no seats on the car. It's all wounded, head to boots. On stretchers on the floor, 6 across, about a foot clearance on each side. Several have plasma bottles suspended above their right shoulders. A few have their eyes open. It's quiet except for snoring and a few groans. There's no nurse or medic in the car. "This isn't our car," the PR officer says. Mickey kneels next to a stretcher. "How you doing, soldier?" "Mickey Rooney?" the soldier says. "I'll be goddamn. In the flesh. You'd prefer Betty Grable, I know, but I'll have to do. How'd you get this light duty?" "Schumann, Hurtgen Forest. Every man in this car is 28th Division." He raises his head. "It's going to be a month of ice cream and beautiful nurses for you," Mickey says. "We got to go to our car now. Here." Mickey puts an autographed yo-yo in the soldier's hand. "Something to do while you get better." As his squad is leaving the car, Mickey Rooney turns back to the wounded men and shouts in a conductor's voice, "All aboard the Big Rock Candy Mountain Express. Destination Garsh, the American First General Hospital. 3 hots a day, ice cream, fresh linens, and sponge baths from topless nurses." And miles out of 88 range. Smiles appear on a few faces of the dozen or so conscious men on the floor. The rest are in sedative comas, simply unconscious, or too weak to react. Or in the case of Sergeant Joseph Emmerbach of Waterloo, Iowa, 25, recently deceased. Finally, and what my book is about, in the combat zone, these MOS 442s put on jeep shows, what I wrote my book about, for combat infantry in places where the USO and the Red Cross could not go. Now, as we've talked about, I have spoken with historians who specialize in World War II, and I've spoken to many, many, many World War II buffs. I've become one myself. No one has ever heard of military occupation specialty 442 or these entertainment soldiers. How I found out about it, I was going to write a book about the Oxydol Circus. My first employer was Procter & Gamble, that soap company in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Oxydol Circus was a 1968 disastrous promotion, humorous only in retrospect. But if you'll note, the circus promoter is that fellow from West Virginia we looked at, James Hetzer. So as part of my research, Jim Hetzer is gone. As part of my research, I got in touch with his daughter. And she said, "Oh yes, he had a circus, he toured the US and Canada, did many, many things, but did you know that he was an entertainment soldier in World War II, and that he did jeep shows with Mickey Rooney?" And of course I said, "What are jeeps?" "No, I didn't know that." She explained further. And then she said, "And by the way, his older sister, Mabel, saved every letter he wrote home from training camp and from the European Theater of Operations. And I said, oh, can I come down to Dallas and read those letters? I'll put on, you know, cotton archival gloves and I'll be very careful. And she said, oh, don't worry, we put them in a book. So I got that book, and I had about 150 letters describing all this activity. She told me that Jim Hetzer, after the war, a promoter, Jim and his more talented wife had gone to New York in the late 30s and failed to make it as entertainers, a ballroom dance couple, I guess Fred and Ginger type act. So they returned to West Virginia. In 1940, he opened a small business as an agent and a producer. And then in 1944, he volunteered at age 29 for the Army. He did not have to go. He was the father of a young child. Many of you know this, many of you don't, but local draft boards in World War II almost never drafted fathers of children. So he did not have to go. Based on his show business experience, he was detailed to the Morale Corps as an entertainment specialist, MOS 443, and then he did Jeep shows with, there's Mickey Rooney, there's the third member of this Jeep show crew, Bruce Paul, and there is our friend from West Virginia, Jim Hetzer. You will note that the 6'2" Jim Hetzer is sitting, and of course the reason he's sitting is when you're doing publicity photos with Mickey Rooney, you do not want to tower over him. Rooney once said he was too short to be a leading man, too tall to be a producer. 5'1". In this picture was taken in Germany just a few days after VE Day, surrender of Germany. They actually did a command performance for Soviet generals at the request of General Omar Bradley. So this was probably a real high point in their service. I've had a long-standing interest in the topic of morale, why we do the hard things, or we don't do the hard things that we really should do when they need to be done, whether we want to or not. I've had a long-standing interest in it. I wrote a nonfiction book on the topic. So I decided to write, instead of the Oxidol Circus, which I might get to someday, I decided to write this book about these enlisted entertainers, inspired by the real life of Jim Hetzer. Now, I don't know if any of you have started a really big project, but sometimes when you do, the universe will just drop something in your lap that really fits in. I found this on the endless internet. This is the manual this is from early 1944 of ETO USA, European Theater of Operations, United States Army, Special and Morale Services Guide. Now, veterans already know this, but the Army has a manual for every job. And so I had this manual describing how all these things were supposed to be done, and the equipment, and the names of the equipment, and all that, so it was very, very helpful. I also went to the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge took place, with my oldest son, which was a great experience. It was also conveniently extremely cold when we were there, and very foggy, which is exactly what the soldiers were putting up with during the Battle of the Bulge. I went to host, this is a plaque by some citizens of Luxembourg near a place called Hosingen to the 28th Division, K Company of the 28th Division. The 28th Division, as you could probably guess, was the Pennsylvania National Guard until it was federalized in 1941. And interestingly, this was their insignia on their sleeve. The German soldiers misinterpreted that and called them the Bloody Bucket Division. I walked out in front of the Hosingen in Luxembourg. It's about half a mile from the German border, and basically it just goes downhill to a stream that you can walk across practically, and that's the border. So I walked in front of the village and looked towards the German border. And this is, well, I'll just ask you a question. How would you feel if on the morning of December 16th, 1944, you had just survived an hour-long artillery barrage starting at about 5 a.m., and as the sun was rising, you were sent to your foxhole, probably right about here, and then German troops started to appear coming over the hill. I will describe how our hero, Jim, feels about it. He is actually up, there is a water tower in Hosingen, and that's where the Army had an observation post. So Jim is up in the water tower. Take the watch a minute, Jim, Corrigan says. He hands Jim the binoculars and crouches below the wall to light a cigarette. Jim edges out of the faint yellow matchlight. To look like he knows what he's doing, Jim scans 180 degrees in front of the water tower, over and back, over and back. It's coming on full light. The ground fog is lifting. On the sixth over, he sees a handful of vibrating squiggles. They become half a dozen small white ghosts. He feels like he must be dreaming. More ghosts appear behind him. He turns. What's that yonder, fellas? Papa 10, this is Mike 3, Bromberg shouts into the walkie-talkie. He gets an answer and lowers his voice. Company-sized formation, cresting the hill, moving west through the beet field, half left of OP water tower. Range estimate 500 yards. Adjust fire from Whiskey Papa. Map 22, Whiskey Papa Bear. Grid 153-42367. Over. He turns to Jim and Corrigan. One round, high explosive. Look for fall shot. Jim crouches as low as possible while still being able to see out. His sweaty left hand on the top of the wall, his sweaty right hand on the pineapple body of the grenade in his pocket. He doesn't think he can move an inch, let alone pull the pin and drop it down the stairs. He notices the Germans' winter white uniforms as they begin to move at quick time, silently becoming the size of flies on a ceiling. 3 groups, each 20 wide, 5 deep. A ripping sound starts in the distance. The Germans bend forward noticeably. Trout machine guns firing over their heads, Bromberg said, at our boys. We got a box seat to an infantry assault without armor. Thank you, Jesus, against a defended position. Kraus must think we were killed by their artillery, or we ran. Over his heartbeats, Jim hears a punk. Half a minute later, a brown and white geyser erupts in front of the middle German formation, followed by a pang. 2 Germans drop like abandoned marionettes. A third falls to his knees. The soldiers behind step around them, continue forward. So that's what I thought it must have been like for a frontline soldier who's seeing the very first wave of the Battle of the Bulge. Harrowing. As part of my research, I read many, many letters written home by combat infantry. I watched many training films from the war, including the wildly optimistic training film, How to Kill a Tank, with a bazooka, with M1 rocket launcher, which we call a bazooka. But a really important part of my research, most of you probably know Willie and Joe. These were cartoons that cartoonist Sergeant Bill Malden wrote for Stars and Stripes. Willie is saying to Joe, yesterday you saved my life and I swore I'd pay you back. Here's my last pair of dry socks. Malden's infantry duo gave voice to the combat soldiers' frustration with Army bureaucracy, bad chow, and life at the front. But Willie and Joe were beloved by infantrymen. They were not beloved at all by General George Patton and some other senior officers, but Eisenhower, the boss of Patton's boss, saw the morale value in letting soldiers know that their complaints are being heard and kept Willie and Joe in the fight. Now, I did a couple of years of research. Why so much research for a novel? Well, what I learned is when you write fiction, it has to seem real. you can't have extraordinary coincidences in fiction or people won't believe it. And then when you write historical fiction, you're often writing for a specific group of people that already know a lot about what you're writing about. And if you make mistakes, they just probably stop reading. The other, and maybe the more important reason, is research is really fun and writing is really hard. So a great way to procrastinate is to keep researching and keep researching. One topic I dramatically over-researched on was the Queen Mary troop ship. And the reason I over-researched on it is my dad, Robert E. O'Connor, that 19-year-old GI, went over to Europe on the Queen Mary. Queen Mary was the fastest ship in the ocean. It was, of course, the premier luxury liner before the war. Here you can see it's painted battleship gray here. It carried 2,300 passengers as a cruise ship. It carried 15,500 GIs going over to Europe when my dad did it. So I researched it, and again I wrote a passage. I put the character here in the shoes of my dad and had him on the Queen Mary, and he wrote home to tell his older sister a little bit about what it was like. Now, of course, as you all know, letters got censored. I'm going to read the censored words, and not so you can get the full picture. Dear Norma, well, sis, I'm sitting on the top deck. No deck chairs on this cruise. Hey, of the famous Queen Mary. It's called the weather deck. Guess why? We left New York in a convoy 4 days ago. Destroyers on either side, blimp overhead, planes circling. By nightfall, we were in open ocean by ourselves. Safer that way, they told us, because the Queen does 30 knots, more than 30 miles per hour, which is faster than the escorts, and most important, faster than the German U-boats. The Queen makes a sharp zig or zag every 7 minutes. Knocked me off balance the first couple of days. We feel engine vibrations and the ship creaks when she turns. I'm used to it now. The line for chow is an hour long. Enlisted men are fed in what was the first-class dining hall before the war. They feed 1,000 of us at a time. It's elbow to elbow. We sit on benches at long tables, like at Camp Roosevelt in the Civilian Conservation Corps. All the style of gassing up a Jeep at the motor pool, plus belching and a lot of open-mouthed chewing. We get mostly bully beef, which is British spam, and hard-boiled eggs, potatoes, green peas, and hot tea. Forget about coffee. The Queen's Grand Staircase is still here, but the carpet's been pulled up and the wood paneling is covered with burlap. It's like an Oriental bazaar, soldiers selling everything from liquor to deck passes. You have to step carefully not to put your foot in a poker game. I haven't seen an officer since we left New York. This museum is dedicated to teaching the history and the lessons of World War II. The lesson that I'm talking about tonight is the lesson of morale. Napoleon said, in war, morale is to the material as 3 is to 1. As you can see from some of the exhibits here, morale is essential to victory. Morale is essential to persevering during hard times. And what could be more hard times, what could be more trying than being combat infantry subject to a massive surprise attack by a German army? That was the Battle of the Bulge. The Army saw morale as a strategic asset in World War II. The Morale Division was established in 1941 and renamed Special Services a little bit later. Their primary tactics were Hollywood movies. They screened hundreds and hundreds of movies worldwide for soldiers. There was Stars and Stripes, a daily soldiers newspaper. There was Yank, a weekly magazine for soldiers. And then there were books, and this is an armed service edition, and you will see several excellent samples of it. I want to point out to you that this describes the shape of the book. It was printed as a rectangle. The pages were printed two up here, and it was made to fit in the pocket of a soldier's field jacket. And 120 million were distributed free to soldiers during the war. Betty Smith's novel, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, was the most popular, and she got hundreds and hundreds of wonderful letters from soldiers talking about what it meant to them, you know, sitting in a foxhole or on a beach in the Pacific to read that book about life in Britain. The Morale Corps also did correspondence courses for soldiers wanting to spend some time getting an education. And then they put on, as I said, soldier shows for cast and crew of soldiers. But other than the reading material, the Morale Corps couldn't do anything for the frontline combat soldiers, the men doing the fighting. So Jeep shows had to be invented. Before we talk a little bit more about Jeep shows, I'd like to give you my impression of what it was like to be combat infantry in the European theater of operations in World War II. First of all, only 1 in 5 soldiers in Europe were combat infantry. The rest were support personnel. I want to show you that that did not go unnoticed by combat infantry. Jim has been retreating away from the Germans, and he finds himself at a crossroads in a foxhole with another soldier, waiting uncomfortably for the German army to advance down that road. The other soldier's name is Ali. Ali points to the Morale Corps insignia on Jim's sleeve. That flash, not 28th Division, Jim says. I'm Morale Corps, Battalion 6817, entertainment specialist. Hell bells, Jim. What are you doing at the front? I'm trying to get to the communication zone. Everybody wants to get to the rear, especially now. We have shows booked, down in Lorraine, 3rd Army. Ali says, you'll have to get through this show first. Hold your hand over my flashlight. Ali picks up Jim's rifle and brushes dirt off the stock. Let's check your action. We're both going to want this thing to shoot. Thanks. Safety's on, good start, Ali says, pulling back the bolt, which locks with a metallic clink. Chamber's empty. Of course, what you think is the rear is going to depend on where you find yourself. If the sergeant picks us out for patrol, this foxhole, 300 yards in front of our tanks, this foxhole is the cozy home we want to get back to. Ali pulls the ammo clip from the magazine and turns it over in the flashlight beam. All 8 rounds are here. How many clips did you bring with you? 2 more, Jim says. But while we're in this foxhole, Ali points over his shoulder, back there is the place we want to be. If we're back there, though, platoon command post is the safest place in the world. If we were at platoon, we'd be thinking about how to get back to company, headquarters. At company, we'd look for an excuse to visit battalion. He takes the flashlight and shines it down the rifle barrel. Of course, at battalion, we'd begrudge regiment. At regiment, we'd curse the bastards in division. Division wants to be at corps, corps at army, army at base section, and believe it or not, Ripley, base section has a low opinion of soldiers back in the States. So the combat soldiers were not ignorant of their position. And you start to wonder how they did it. Unlike pilots who were rotated back to the States after a certain number of usually extremely dangerous combat missions, they were rotated back to the States to train new pilots. Combat infantry never got rotated back. Even divisions that were greatly depleted did not get rotated back. They got individual replacements instead, which, by the way, was very dangerous for the individual replacement because they were usually very green soldiers, and the veterans in the units they were joining did not trust them for at least a couple of weeks. So they had it tough for a while. After the late July breakout from Normandy, the army, the infantry advanced with amazing speed right to the border of Germany. There was the largest battle in that fall of 1944 was Hürtgen Forest, fought from September to February of 1944, and it was fought in a dense, rugged woodlands. The Germans were well prepared to defend German territory, And it was one of the most grueling and costly engagements of the war for United States soldiers. And at Hurtgen Forest and many other places, the combat infantry experienced, first of all, chronic discomfort. It was very cold and wet. Obviously, periodic chaos and extreme violence, and the inevitable loss of some of their buddies to wounds or death. Rear echelon soldiers did not experience any of this. Then there was the cold. It was the coldest winter in Europe for 40 years, and as historian Richard Atkinson has written, winter always seemed to catch the U.S. Army by surprise. In September of 1944, when things had gone so well, the thinking was this war will be over by Christmas. And the Army did a very poor job of supplying winter clothing to frontline infantry in the European theater of operations. A lot of the best, other than ammunition and weapons, a lot of the best supplies never made it to the front line. So you wonder about their morale, how they did it. Now, combat infantry was also isolated from the rest of the Army, and just like every soldier over there, they were isolated from their friends and family at home. So I asked myself the question, how did they fight so long and so well? How did they persevere? What was the source of their resilience? I'll read you a little incident that our reluctant hero runs into that gives us a hint. He has run into a small group of combat engineers and been pulled into their unit. They are in a farmhouse outside of Longville in Belgium, again, waiting for the Germans to come down the road. Jim speaks up. Like I said, Sergeant, I'm a runner. He touches the dressing on his face. I have a captured German map. Important that it get to General Middleton in Bastogne. Sergeant Rizzo has had enough. It can't be too important. They let you keep it, he says, and points to Jim's rifle. What you got there, Private Tanzer? The combat man nearby smiles. He's heard this routine before. That's my rifle, Sarge, Jim says. Correct. Are you a man or a woman, Tanzer? Yes, Sarge, a man. You're a man with a rifle, Rizzo continues, smiling. You're a goddamn rifleman, Private. And these men, he extends his arm, are your goddamn buddies. And you are their goddamn buddy. And you don't run down the road, leave your buddies in a tight spot. Capiche? What Sergeant Rizzo was saying, in other words, is, you're one of us now, Private Tanzer, and you have some obligations to us, and we have some obligations to you. Morale. The USO, of course, was civilian, as I've said, were civilian organizations. They could not go in combat areas. There, by the way, is Mickey Rooney after a very, very snowy Jeep show with some of the soldiers from the audience. So being there was important. An Army captain named Joshua Logan, who was in the Morale Corps, went on to direct South Pacific, Annie Get Your Gun, and many other famous Broadway shows, invented Jeep shows as a way to boost morale for frontline troops through entertainment. And Jeep shows, as I said, were 3 entertainment soldiers, Mickey, Rooney, Jim Hetzer, and Bruce Paul were one Jeep show pair, and a driver. And they drive a Jeep to just behind the front lines, where combat infantry is pulled back for maybe a hot meal, possibly a uniform exchange, but this is within artillery and sniper range. Here is Mickey Rooney entertaining the 44th Division in a Jeep show. Now, perhaps, I did stumble onto this thought, perhaps the reason that entertainment soldiers aren't well known, and they would be standing right behind Mickey here, is Mickey got all the press. So the rest of them didn't get much. Here is again our hero, the inspiration, Jim Hetzer, and 2 other entertainment soldiers, absolutely murdering the ballad Flo, I Got to Go Where You Are. and really cutting up. A typical Jeep show performance was stand-up comedy. They tell jokes, they do a two-man act, some singing, some dancing. Let me give you an example of a typical Mickey Rooney joke. Sorry, love, I should have handed that back to you. Now you boys know I'd rather fight than tell jokes, Mickey says. I'm the only soldier that can look Tojo in the eye. Laughing. Now, I was going to be a paratrooper. Glory and $5 more a month. First jump, the red light by the door switches on. I'm too scared to move. Jump master says to me, jump, Rooney, or I'll put my boot up your keister. Jim calls in from the wings. Did you jump? Mickey shrugs, just a little. Thank you, he says. Now it's time for one of your own. One of the other features of Jeep shows is they would always try to pull a soldier out of the audience. You know, they'd ask, and the guy's buddies would say, oh yeah, Bill does great impressions. And so they'd always try to pull a soldier out of the audience. Here's an example I put in the book. A thin, dark-haired young man in a shiny uniform, and that's how you knew green soldiers is their uniform was shiny, steps up next to Mickey. Mickey takes the young man's M1 rifle, quartermaster's tag still attached to the trigger guard, also a dead giveaway of a green soldier. Let me hold this while you sing. He turns back to the crowd. Your Private Levy, Private Jacob Levy, was a cantor in Newark before the war. Mickey examines the rifle's receiver. Manufactured by Underwood. So his rifle was a typewriter. Now, we heard him singing at the Repo Depot a few weeks back. Give him a warm welcome, applause, and calls of encouragement. Levy is a replacement. Most of Company K has never heard his name. Levy sings in heavily accented English. Born in Ansbach, Germany, son of a kosher butcher, Private Levy emigrated to the United States in 1936 at age 12. He's nervous in front of his fellow GIs. But now they know his name. His chances of surviving the war have increased. He responds to the applause with a truncated Lily Marlene. Wes, the accordion player, can play that one in his sleep. That's a Jeep show. That's a Jeep show too. The Jeep shows were very, very well received by not only the combat infantry, but also the brass. I can find it one if you can. So this is a picture of an actual memo I came across. I'll just read you the key points. Jeep show number 1 to 6 were attached to 8 Corps Morale Corps officer on 5 December 1944. Every effort was made to book the teams with the combat troops close to the front. The benefit to morale projected by the hard work of these performers in putting on as many as 11 shows in one day in places formerly thought unapproachable with entertainment has made their outstanding performance of duty exceptionally valuable to this command. This office urgently requests additional Jeep shows. So they worked. They worked. The presence of entertainment soldiers reminded the combat soldiers of life before the war and kind of made a promise that there would be life after the war. One soldier recalled, they didn't have to say a word. Just seeing them there, knowing someone came all this way to cheer us up, it made us feel like we were still human. Now, there was a British organization that was entertaining British soldiers. It's called ENSA, the initials ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association. The British Tommies fondly called it ENSA, every night something awful. Apparently there was always an organ and always roll out the barrel. So that's how they do it. I wrote a passage where Jim, our hero, was talking with an ENSA entertainer, and it really captured what I've a fundamental point about morale, any of ours matter. This is the Ensa entertainer. He's saying, I did, and I won't do the Cockney accent because it just wouldn't work. I did a 7-month tour of Africa in '42. Now you saw me tonight. I'm not but a poor man's George Formby. And then he says, the music hall and film star, because Jim doesn't know. And he says, but imagine you're a 19-year-old Tommy from Lancashire. Never been farther than Blackpool for a donkey ride. Him and his mates are guarding an oil field in Libya, 1,000 miles from home. Mail and rations delivered once a week. 120 degrees, sand fleas, bath once a month, can't even get Lord Haw-Haw on the wireless. Well, you're chuffed to see anyone from England, aren't you? Scotland will do, even Ireland, he says in a passable brogue. You're good with impressions, Jim says, to be agreeable. Not a bit, the comedian says. My act is half pie. I'm no name and never will be. Don't have the gifts. But the thing is, mate, morale is the showing up, the being there. The performance, sure, but also the natter over tea and a biscuit. Letting the lads know they're not forgotten, like letters from home. That I can do. Now, if you reflect on your own life, you know, when something terrible happens to a family member or a good friend, you know, they don't need you to come over and give them all the answers, you know, even if you had all the answers. What they need you to do is be present. Take a walk, play a hand of cards, watch a movie, whatever. Being present for friends and family during difficult times, that's what we can do that helps the most. And that to me is the core to the morale building effect of these entertainment soldiers doing shows for combat soldiers up at the front. Just for conversation, I wanted to tell you about the adventures the main character has. As we talked about, he gets stuck up on the German border at a town in Luxembourg called Hosingen, and happens to be there by accident the day that the Battle of the Bulge starts. He retreats to Clairvaux, then Antonio Shaft, that's where he was talking with the soldier, and the soldier was talking about getting to the rear. That's where he was with the combat engineers at Longeville. And then he finally ends up in Bastogne. And in Bastogne, he joins a group of stragglers from overrun infantry companies, but also rear echelon soldiers in Bastogne, you know, cooks, telephone operators, mechanics, and then in my book, one entertainment soldier. But what really happened is these soldiers were organized into a group called Team Snafu. Snafu being the Army terminology for situation normal, all effed up. And Team Snafu was instrumental in supporting the gallant and famous 101st Airborne Division in the defense of Bastogne. So that's why I had Jim. Every one of these places was a battle to try to delay the German forces, and then holding out in Bastogne, delay the German forces because Bastogne is a road hub. I'd also like to tell you about 3 things that fascinated me during my research. The field jacket, combat soldiers did not like to carry packs because packs could be lost or borrowed by somebody, and they were just in general, combat soldiers did not want to be burdened. These pockets were huge, and if you stopped a combat soldier and maybe you emptied out this pocket, you would take out probably a K-ration breakfast, a toothbrush, a spoon, some letters from his wife, a hand grenade, and a couple of clips. And then there might be tree grows in Brooklyn here, and another K ration, and there'd be things up here, and maybe souvenirs here. This jacket was essentially a suitcase with sleeves, and it was much beloved during the war. This is the standard issue rifle, the M1 Garand. I'm sure most of you know that. Fully loaded, it weighed 13 pounds. So imagine carrying a bowling ball around all day, day after day, week after week. It loaded a clip. It was an automatic, so a clip of 8 rounds loaded here. There's an incident in the book where our poor hero gets what's called M1 thumb. M1 thumb happened to inexperienced soldiers. When the clip was empty, it popped out, and you had to jam another clip down into the magazine. And when the clip popped out, that bolt shot forward. And while you were jamming the clip into the new clip in, if you trailed your thumb in that area, because the bolt shot back as soon as you jammed the clip in it, you got what was called M1 thumb, which was a bloody thumb and then a 3-month bruise on your thumb. I was fascinated by the M9 rocket launcher, nicknamed the bazooka. It took 2 men to fire it, a loader in the back and then a trigger man. And this fearsome tank killer weapon had an electrical firing system operated by 1 D-cell battery. It took, soldiers did kill tanks with that, but I'm amazed at the courage that must have taken. I wanted to end, I created a character in Jeep Show called the War Correspondent, because when you're writing fiction, it's good to have a character who will explain everything to the other characters so that you can tell your readers things you want them to know without having to tell the readers yourself. So I created a war correspondent, and our hero, Jim Tanzer, meets the war correspondent in Bastogne, and the war correspondent explains the defense of Bastogne. When I finished the book, I didn't know what to do for an epilogue, so I had the war correspondent write a column for his newspaper, which, by the way, in the story, the editor never ran because he didn't want the column from a war correspondent. But I had the war correspondent write a column for the newspaper looking back on the war in 1946. And I just want to read you one section, and I think we gave each of you a copy of this. My voice will catch when I'm reading some of this. I just find it moving. Makes me think about my dad and think about, all the men and young men. So the war correspondent has written this long column. Then he says, "My last words have to be about our boys who went to war on the ground. They were in a completely different army than the armies of the other belligerents. Germany's was an army of professionals up until late into their war. The Red Army was filled out by peasants and factory workers with guns at their backs. The British Army reflected that nation's traditional class distinctions. The Japanese Army was its own feudal society, emphasizing loyalty to superiors and a strong sense of honor and self-sacrifice. By 1944, all 4 of these armies were wasting assets. America's army was increasing in size and power as the war neared its end. The American Army was larger than the nation's other military services combined. Unlike the Navy and its Marine Corps, the Army had to rely on the draft to fill its ranks. If the other services were to some extent cherry-picked from American society, the Army was America itself, a cross-section of all the nation's geographic, religious, economic, and ethnic groups, including Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. The 3 fighting faiths. In the service of victory, we invented both the atom bomb and the idea of a Judeo-Christian nation. The Army drafted Americans from the economically backward South to the bustling industrial cities of the Midwest. from the fisheries of Maine to the timber country of the Pacific Northwest, from the Wyoming ranches to the garment factories of New York, from the North Dakota wheat fields to the Mississippi cotton fields. The Army drafted PhDs. The Army drafted immigrants who the Army had to teach to read and write the language of the country they served. It had to be this way, given the manpower needed to fight a war on two fronts. It was also fitting, given the ideals America said it was fighting for. America fielded millions of citizen soldiers who disliked the goddamn Army, were ambivalent about their officers, and resisted the trappings of military hierarchy, also known as chicken shit. Yet many of them will remember their service as the ennobling experience of their lives. If you ask them, they will tell you they fought not for their country or lofty ideals, but for each other, for their buddies, to get the job done and get home. And when I think about morale, when I think about when we are at our best, when we do our best, it's when we do for others. And that's what I learned from Jeep Show. Thank you. Are there any?